media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. Going to spend a little bit of time looking back to last night, the Democratic presidential debate. Tonight is the Republican presidential debate, and there are lots of rumors swirling around. One of those rumors is that Marco Rubio is finished in Florida, according to the chairman there in that particular state, the former chairman. And some are saying, well, is he going to drop out? And he still says he's going to go and win in Florida. But again, there are some real questions about that, and we'll see how that plays itself out tonight in the Republican debate. But we're going to focus a little bit of time and attention on the Democratic debate, and also ask some fundamental questions that I know many of you have been asking, and that is, if indeed the presumptive nominees are Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, how do they do? And that is something that is going to be both a pro and a con. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that as well, because Donald Trump likes to say, let me quote him here, we've had tremendous numbers, we're beating everyone. Well, that may be true in many of the polls with his Republican rivals. After all, the only state that was won the other day by Ted Cruz was Idaho, but that doesn't mean anything in terms of the general election. Now, the first thing you want to say is that any poll done in March has little to say about what will happen by November. But it is, I think, interesting that as you look at the various polls that have been done, Hillary Clinton still beats Donald Trump most of the time. If you look at some of the polls during February, for example, you can look at the NBC Wall Street Journal poll, the Quinnipiac poll, and those. You have generally Hillary Clinton winning by 7 to 5 points. Although by the time you get to one in the kind of the middle of February, there was one poll, a USA Today Suffolk poll, that had Trump winning by 2 points. Since then, all the other polls, a Fox News poll, a Rasmussen poll, an ABC News, Washington Post poll, all have Hillary Clinton winning by 5 points to all the way up to 13 points. But there are others that have said maybe this is irrelevant because, after all, you are elected by the Electoral College. And isn't it possible that this really very good showing by Donald Trump in Michigan and the very poor showing by Hillary Clinton in Michigan puts a particular state like Michigan in play? And Tim Alberta has written about that, so we're going to get into those issues as well and spend a little bit of time talking about this. Second hour, as always, I like to kind of get away from this, but we won't going to get too far because we're going to have Lawrence Lindsey with us. His book, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class, How to Break Their Grip Forever. I know when the book came across my desk, I said, we have got to do this interview because most people would consider Lawrence Lindsey to be part of the ruling class. If not, he certainly is an insider like nobody is an insider. He actually was a Harvard professor. He was on the board of the Federal Reserve. He actually served under 3 different presidents. I mean, you can't get much more of an insider than that. Yet on many of the topics we address here around the round table, he probably would agree with us in terms of how more and more of those decisions are being made by unelected bureaucrats, how more and more power is drifting to Washington away from the localities and from the states. So we're going to be talking with him, give you a chance to hear some of his comments and ask him some questions as well. But let's get to last night. Didn't take long for some of the questions to cause Hillary Clinton to bristle. One of those came about the email scandals, and Jorge Ramos said, in light of this private email server, he said, that goes against the memo that you personally sent to your employees in 2011, directing all of them to use official email precisely because of security concerns. So then he says, so it seems that you issued one set of rules for yourself and a different set of rules for the rest of the department. Who specifically gave you permission to operate your email system as you did? Was it President Barack Obama? And would you drop out of the race if you get indicted? Here's what she had to say.
Well, Jorge, there's a lot of questions in there, and I'm going to give the same answer I've been giving for many months. It wasn't the best choice. I made a mistake. It was not prohibited. It was not in any way disallowed. And as I've said, and as now has come out, my predecessors did the same thing, and many other people in the government. But here's the cut-to-the-chase facts. I did not send or receive any emails marked classified at the time. What you're talking about is retroactive classification. And the reason that happens is when somebody asks, or when you are asked to make information public. I asked all my emails to be made public. Then all the rest of the government gets to weigh in. And some other parts of the government, we're not exactly sure who, has concluded that some of the emails should be now retroactively classified. They've just said the same thing to former Secretary Colin Powell. They have said, we're going to retroactively classify emails you sent personally. Now, I think he was right when he said this is an absurdity. And I think that what we've got here is a case of overclassification. I am not concerned about it. I am not worried about it. And no Democrat or American should be either.
The questions were, Secretary Clinton, the questions were, who gave you permission to operate? Was it President Obama?
There was no permission to be asked. It had been done by my predecessors. It was permitted. I didn't have to ask anyone.
If you get indicted, would you drop out?
Oh, for goodness, that is not going to happen. I'm not even answering that question.
So again, you see the reaction there. I'm not going to answer that question. Now, we can get into the details of all of this, but what, quote, happened to Colin Powell is a little bit different than with Hillary Clinton. When you retroactively classify something, very different than those which were classified, and of course, lots of evidence to suggest that they even stripped out some of the classified information or the designation to be able to send it through the email. So there's a lot more going on than that. But nevertheless, it showed two things. Number one, the frustration that comes when that question is asked. And let's be honest, it hasn't been asked of her very often. Then the reaction from the audience that basically says, we don't care. And then, as she said, oh, for goodness, I'm not even going to, that's not going to happen. I'm not even going to answer that. And of course, the loud cheers. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what is happening right now in terms of the issue of the email scandals. When we come back, there are some other questions that were asked of her about, well, you lost in Michigan. What about that? Then reaction from both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton to the idea of Donald Trump building a wall. Then we'll get into some of the criticism that Hillary Clinton lodged at Bernie Sanders for standing with the Minuteman, which, again, I think illustrates a point. This would be controversial in a Democratic area, but all the other things Bernie has done, I think, are going to be really controversial to the general public. And then, of course, got to have some comment about everything from fracking to climate change. So those are just a few things from the debate last night. And as we go along here, we're going to also not only talk about what has happened in the Democratic Party, but what could happen if indeed she is indicted? And more importantly, is it possible that indeed Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump if he is the nominee? Would Hillary Clinton beat Ted Cruz if he is the nominee? So we have a lot to talk about in this first hour. And at any point, if you would like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We've had some full lines in the last couple of days. So if you've been trying to get through, now's your chance. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee, how difficult would it be for him to be elected president? To understand the challenge, it is worth looking at the electoral map, because any Republican nominee faces some significant challenges. A candidate needs 270 electoral votes to be elected president. Hillary Clinton starts with a significant advantage since there are 18 states and the District of Columbia that have voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. These are the New England states, except New Hampshire, a number of other eastern states, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. They also include states in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and they also include the West Coast states of California, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington. These 18 states and the District of Columbia total 242 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton only needs to find 28 more electoral votes in order to achieve the 270 electoral votes. If Donald Trump cannot challenge in any of these blue states, then he must keep all the red states and nearly run the table on most of the toss-up states like Florida, Ohio, and Virginia. America's demographic makeup is another challenge. President Obama received over 90% of the African American vote and over 70% of the Hispanic American vote. Hillary Clinton may not do quite as well, but her vote percentages will certainly be close to those of candidate Barack Obama. Will Donald Trump receive more than 10% of the black vote? Perhaps, but that is doubtful. Will he receive more than 30% of the Latino vote? That is certainly unlikely since Donald Trump's negatives among Hispanics are the highest of any Republican candidate. Once you look at the electoral map, you can begin to see why many question whether Donald Trump could win in November. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Focus Features and Motive Entertainment present The Young Messiah, a story of Jesus as a youth, in theaters March 11th, rated PG-13. YoungMessiahResources.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
If you'd like to join our conversation today, 1-800-351-1212. I'll get to some of those phone calls in just a minute. Let me play at least one more clip from the Democratic presidential debate last night. And this was another really important issue because most people thought that this would be a very easy march for Hillary Clinton to a coronation of being the nominee. What happened in Michigan was certainly another one of those wake-up calls, and that is Bernie Sanders beat her pretty well. Now, she still ended up with more delegates out of Michigan because, again, that's that the undemocratic Democratic primary set of rules with the super delegates. But nevertheless, that was something of great concern. So she was asked last night, why did she lose in Michigan?
Well, look, I won one of the contests and lost another close one. I'm continuing to work hard for every single vote across our country. I was pleased that I got 100,000 more votes last night than my opponent and more delegates. So this is a marathon, and it's a marathon that can only be carried out by the kind of inclusive campaign that I'm running, a campaign that reaches out to everybody, a campaign that offers real positive solutions to the problems that we face, a campaign that is based on how together we can make progress, because I am a progressive who likes to get things done. So I'm excited about the upcoming contests, including right here in Florida, and will continue to work as hard as I can to earn the vote of every single voter.
What failed in Michigan specifically?
It was a very close race. We've had some of those. I've won some, I've lost some, but I was very pleased by the overall outcome last night. And now we're on to the states for next Tuesday, and I'm looking forward to campaigning hard in all of them.
So again, just a few of the comments from last night. We'll have a few more in just a minute. But along the way, I would like to take some phone calls. So let's head out to South Carolina first. Mike, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, I appreciate everything you do. I'm looking at the primary numbers, and I think that Cruz or Trump, either one of them could beat Hillary if you look at the primary numbers, where it looks like there's an average of 4-to-1 voter turnout Republican versus Democrat.
And I think you are onto something, because these polls only mean something if you can get a pretty good estimate of who are likely voters. And what has happened in a couple of those cases is likely voters didn't turn out. Let's take Hillary Clinton in Michigan first. They had her winning, according to the polls, by 20%. She lost pretty significantly. Now, she said it was close, but that shows the lack of enthusiasm on the Democratic Party side. Now, let's make the other part of your equation even more meaningful. In round numbers, it's a little bit more than this, but there's almost a 60% increase in the Republican turnout in most of these primaries and caucuses. So that shows a lot of enthusiasm. And so that does bode well for a Ted Cruz or for a Donald Trump, if indeed that enthusiasm you see now in February and March all the way through maybe to June ends up showing up in November. Because go ahead.
That's what we'll have to do. We'll have to make sure the Republican voters turn out during the election. And I encourage everybody to get out and vote. Bring your church members, bring your family. Even if it's not your chosen candidate, we still need to get out and support a change.
Very good. Mike, appreciate your call. And one of the reasons we have on our Pray, Organize, and Vote section here, which encourages you to take the pledge, is I'm hearing a lot of people say, well, I just won't vote. Well, okay, even if you say I couldn't vote for either Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton, I hope you will still vote, because there are other candidates running, 34 United States senators, Senate races, 535 races for the House of Representatives. There are 44 different states that are electing state legislatures, 14 different states that are electing governors. There are a lot of important races, so please don't stay home, and that is something we've done in the past. Let me, just before we take another phone call, though, also talk about this electoral map. And if you would like to read more about this, that is my commentary today. And just to, again, illustrate some of the challenges that a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz would have, look at the fact that the electoral map right now is weighted in favor of the Democrats. And we'll assume that Hillary Clinton is the nominee, because there's every reason to believe so, since she has 1,200 delegates so far. But you need, in the general election, 270 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton really starts out with an enormous advantage, because you have 18 states and the District of Columbia that have voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. These are very easy to kind of put together. And again, I have the list on my commentary, which I would encourage you to print out, maybe even send to some people, put it on your Facebook, get some conversation started, because this would include all of the New England states, with the exception of New Hampshire, which is a little bit of a toss-up state sometimes. Then a number of eastern states like Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. Then you have a few in the upper Midwest, and that's Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin. And then you have the West Coast states, which are California, Oregon, Washington, Hawaii. Those 18 states and the District of Columbia total, 242 electoral votes. You only need 270 electoral votes, so it means that Hillary Clinton only has to go and find 28 more electoral votes somewhere. But as I point out in the commentary, and as Tim Alberta points out today in a very good piece, saying Michigan shows Trump could redraw the electoral map, if indeed Donald Trump does as well in the fall as he did in the primary in Michigan, where the turnout for him was very large and the turnout for her was very small, then he could actually pick off one of those traditionally Democrat states like Michigan. Now, it would be a lot more significant if he could pick off his home state, New York, but every poll I've ever seen shows that Hillary Clinton, the former senator from New York, beats Donald Trump, a resident of New York, handily. But maybe he picks off maybe next door New Jersey because of his connection with Chris Christie. Doubtful, but possible. I mean, somewhere along the line, either he has to pick off one of those states that she just assumes she's going to have, or else he pretty much has to keep all of his red states and then run the table on a lot of the toss-up states, which would be states like Florida, Ohio, and Virginia. So if you'd like to read a little bit more, my commentary today is all about that electoral map. And just before I take another phone call, let me mention that the demographic issue is another one, and that has to do with the fact that President Obama basically won 90% of the African American vote. Now, is there any reason why a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz could win more than 10% of that? Probably not, but, it's something to think about. On the other hand, when you look at Barack Obama, he won over 70% of the Hispanic American vote. That's where it doesn't work very well for Donald Trump, because after all, he has the highest negatives right now among Hispanics of any Republican candidate. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that just because Ted Cruz has sort of a Latino background, because that is, his dad was Cuban, that he would attract a lot of the Hispanic vote. But if he could attract at least more of the Hispanic vote than, say, Mitt Romney did, that actually means that his candidacy might work better, and he might do better against Hillary Clinton than, say, Donald Trump. So again, a lot of that's in my commentary. I encourage you to visit the website, pointofview.net. It's under our viewpoint section, and we'll certainly give you a chance to read that and interact with it and maybe pass it on to others. Let's also stay in South Carolina for just a minute. Ann, I appreciate your phone call. What would you like to add to our conversation today?
I was just wondering why Trump has not been disqualified from running, because of all of his name calling and.
Well, you can say some pretty awful things and not be disqualified. That goes all the way back to the race in 1800. This was a race between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. And if you think Donald Trump has said a lot of awful things, you have to see what some of the people were saying, not so much the candidates, but their surrogates were saying about each other back in 1800. We'd had two really uneventful campaigns when George Washington ran and then ran again. But then after that, it got pretty controversial. And by the time you have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson running, John Adams running for re-election, essentially, then it got really ugly. So anyway, you're not necessarily disqualified for name calling, but you might ask, I think, a good question, Ann, and that is, why are people still voting for him? Because they don't like his behavior. Is that a fair question?
Excellent. Yeah.
Yes. Well, let's take a break, and we'll take some more phone calls. If you'd like to join the conversation here, 1-800-351-1212. We'll also go back to a couple of more comments that came out during the Democratic presidential debate. We'll look at some of their comments, both Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, about Donald Trump's suggestion of building a wall, given the fact it was broadcast on a Latino network. I think you can understand what some of those comments will be. So we'll come back and take some of your phone calls right after this.
Later this year, for the 58th time, America will choose a president. As a Christian, what are you doing to prepare for the election? Helping you cut through the major media spin is part of the mission of Point of View. We want to provide the best election resources, including a new website, Pray, Organize, Vote, encouraging people to intercede for the upcoming election, to help you get registered so you can exercise the stewardship of voting, to share things to help you get people involved and out to the polls. But to do all of that, we need you to vote right now with your support for Point of View. Show us that you're in this for the long haul as a citizen of heaven as well as the United States. Click Donate Now at the top of the page and give the most generous one-time gift you can at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. There is a lot of work to be done. Let's get to it together. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. We'll get back to the Democratic presidential debate last night in just a moment. Let me finish my point, though, that I was making, and that is, if you look at the latest survey, the NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, it shows that Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump. It also shows at the same time that Texas Senator Ted Cruz or even Florida Senator Marco Rubio would actually draw to a tie with Clinton, or in some cases might actually win. But it isn't really the number of popular votes, although ultimately I think that could be an issue. A lot of it has to do with where those votes are. Let's take a state of Texas as an example, since Ted Cruz is from Texas. He probably would do better in Texas than Donald Trump, but it wouldn't make a whole lot of difference because let's go back 4 years ago, and Mitt Romney was able to beat Barack Obama in the state of Texas by 1.25 million votes, 1,250,000 more votes than Barack Obama, but it didn't make any difference. If he had won by 1,000 votes, he would still get those 38 electoral votes. So yes, he ran up a lot more in that state, and Ted Cruz probably could beat Hillary Clinton in Texas by 2 million votes, possibly. But it wouldn't make any difference because he'd still get the 38 electoral votes, and you need, of course, 270. But at the same time, this is why some people are saying there still seems to be a lot more evidence that a Ted Cruz or a Marco Rubio could beat Hillary Clinton or a Bernie Sanders. And there's pretty good evidence through most of the polls so far that Hillary Clinton would beat Donald Trump. But we'll figure out where that plays out as we go along. And, of course, polls in March don't really mean a whole lot, but they mean something in terms of possibly trying to figure out likely voters. And as Mike pointed out to us, intensity is important as well. I've said politics is more than just numbers. It's also intensity. Because intensity says these are the people that will go out, they'll put up yard signs, they will knock on doors, they will encourage their friends, neighbors, and coworkers, family members to go out and vote. And so intensity means something. So certainly that is the case. Let's go back to the Democratic presidential debate last night, and then we'll take some of your phone calls because I'm sure some of the comments you will hear will generate some thoughts. But we'll go first of all to the reaction both from Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton to the idea of Donald Trump building a wall.
You know, it's just fantasy. And in fact, if he cared to know anything about what members of Congress like the senator and I have done, where it was necessary, we did support some fencing. Where it was necessary, we did add Border Patrol agents. We have done what by any fair estimate would have to conclude is a good job, quote, securing the border. So let's get about the business of comprehensive immigration reform.
Immigration reform is a very hot debate. It's divided the country. But I would hope very much that as we have that debate, we do not, as Donald Trump and others have done, resort to racism and xenophobia and bigotry. This idea of suddenly one day or maybe a night rounding up 11 million people and taking them outside of this country is a vulgar, absurd idea that I would hope very few people in America support.
So again, just a couple of comments. Of course, those are intended to be applause lines, and they are. But as I shared just a minute ago, if indeed that begins to be the perception that is held by individuals who might otherwise be predisposed to vote for a Donald Trump or a Ted Cruz, that then is in the favor of the Democrats. And recognize that we're talking about two issues, but both of them are important. First, where those electoral votes are located in various states. And second of all, the demographic makeup that may or may not have an influence, whether it's the African American vote, the Latino vote, or many others that may be identified. So a couple of key issues there. Let me, if I can, just before I run out of time here, get a couple of more in. And this is one place where Hillary Clinton maybe has found a vulnerability. She's always wanted to attack Bernie Sanders, but it's tough to attack Bernie Sanders when on many issues he's more liberal than you are. It's hard to get to the left of a man who calls himself a democratic socialist. In the early debates, the issue that she was able to bring up had to do with gun control, because in Vermont, he has been much more willing to not put significant limits on Second Amendment rights. As a matter of fact, Vermont and Arizona are two states that are known for having very few restrictions on guns, compared to, say, the neighboring state of New York, where Hillary Clinton has been the senator, where there are many restrictions. As a matter of fact, sometimes when I go to Vermont, I will drive into New York because I actually speak in New York. And when I do, there's actually a sign that you can see that basically says, you're now entering the state of New York, where gun laws are very different than Vermont. And basically, it's a little more strident than that, but you can get the point. But there's one place where Hillary thinks she might have a connection and an opportunity to go after Bernie Sanders, and that is the issue of standing with the Minuteman. It's a little bit of a stretch, but here's at least how she has tried to position him as being somewhat anti-immigrant.
As I said earlier, in 2006, Senator Sanders supported indefinite detention for people facing deportation, and stood with the Minutemen vigilantes in their ridiculous, absurd efforts to, quote, hunt down immigrants. So, look, I think the goal here is to elect a Democratic Senate, elect a Democratic president, and get to work immediately.
Minutemen.
I'm sorry?
Did you support the Minutemen as Secretary of
Of course not. There was a piece of legislation supported by dozens and dozens of members of the House which codified existing legislation. What the Secretary is doing tonight, and has done very often, is take large pieces of legislation and take pieces out of it. No, I did not oppose the bailout or the support of the automobile industry. No, I do not support vigilantes, and that is a horrific statement, an unfair statement to make. I will stand terms of my political career, fighting for workers, fighting for the poorest people in this country. Madam Secretary, I will match my record against yours any day of the week.
So again, pretty hostile as you can pick up there. I do want to play one more, and then I'll take some phone calls. And a lot of the conversations, you can tell, had to do with immigration, because it was on Univision and because it was rebroadcast on CNN and because the moderators really wanted to focus on that. Understandable, because it's in Florida. Why not? But there were some other issues, and there are a lot of other issues presidents need to address. And so one of those that certainly Bernie Sanders has been making a big deal about is the issue of climate change. It is not the top 5 for most voters, nor is immigration, by the way. And yet he has certainly made this a big issue and wanted to make this distinction between him and the Republicans. Here's what he had to say.
When you have Republican candidates for president and in Congress telling you that climate change is a hoax, which is Donald Trump and other candidates' position, what they are really saying is, we don't have the guts to take on the fossil fuel industry.
You can see already what's happening in Miami, particularly Miami Beach, with tides rising. So we do have to invest in resilience and mitigation while we are trying to cut emissions and make up for the fact that this is clearly man-made and man-aggravated. And there are certain things that the president has done through executive action that I will absolutely support. All the Republicans say they will, if they're elected, heaven forbid, repeal all of those executive actions. I will maintain them and act on them. The Clean Power Plan is something that Senator Sanders has said he would delay implementing, which makes absolutely no sense. We need to implement all of the president's executive actions and quickly move to make a bridge from coal to natural gas to clean energy. That is the way we will keep the lights on while we are transitioning to a clean energy future.
Let's be clear. You're looking at the senator who introduced the most comprehensive climate change legislation in the history of the United States Senate. Now, I hope that Secretary Clinton would join me, if we are serious about climate change, about imposing a tax on carbon on the fossil fuel industry and making massive investments in energy efficiency and sustainable energy. And by the way, while we are on the subject of energy, I hope you'll join me in ending fracking in the United States of America.
You can see the implications of that if you would like your energy bills to go up, and if you're convinced that climate change is one of the greatest challenges facing the world today and facing America, then Bernie Sanders is your man. But if not, you might want to look elsewhere. Let's take a break. We'll come back and take some phone calls because we're looking at the electoral map. We're looking at what happened in Michigan. Does that suggest that maybe Donald Trump wins Michigan over Hillary Clinton if he's the nominee, and that changes everything? We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Well, I think you've all heard enough from the Democratic presidential debate. I know some people on the other side of the glass have heard enough, so we're going to end it there. Tomorrow, though, we will be looking at the Republican debate tonight. And if you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. In South Carolina, WLPE. Eileen, thank you for calling today. What would you like to share with our audience?
You are welcome, Kerby. I'm trying to find the system.
Did she accidentally hang up on us, or is she still there? We will see where she is. I think she might have just been reaching for something. Can we find out if she's there? If she is, we will go and get her back on. One of the things she wanted to talk about were the polls, and let me come back to that issue of Michigan, because that's sort of important. Okay, Eileen, I think we have you now.
I'm so sorry, Kerby.
It's okay.
My phone was accidentally on mute.
Sure, no problem at all.
Okay. What I wanted to, there were two things, actually. The first thing was concerning polls. For the last 6 months to 12 months, we've been discussing on the right how polls weren't very accurate.
Sure weren't, especially in Michigan. I mean, it was way off, both on the Democrats and the Republican side. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And what I notice is that, now that Trump, they keep saying that he cannot beat Hillary. And it just seems to me that the people that run the polls, Rove, and, there's a lot of influence from the establishment there in the polls. And they tell us who to be afraid of, who to vote for, et cetera, et cetera.
And again, to be fair, some of these polls are by the Washington Post, so yeah, those are insiders. Some of them are like Fox News, so that's a little bit different. Then you have Quinnipiac and you have Rasmussen. We, matter of fact, had Rasmussen on here. So, there are some people I tend to trust a little bit more. I think generally they wouldn't be in the business if they were always biased. People would ignore them. But I think the biggest problem, Eileen, is they just don't know how many people are going to show up, because let's take on the Democratic side for a minute. Hillary Clinton was supposed to beat Bernie Sanders by 20 points in Michigan. He ended up beating her by 20,000 votes. So that is because they could not get a good estimate on how many people would actually be voting. And if the enthusiasm that you see right now for the Ted Cruz's and even Marco Rubio's, and especially for Donald Trump's, continues, and the lack of enthusiasm that you have for the Democrats, that means a state like Michigan is in play. And if it is, that changes the electoral map, and that's not good news for Hillary Clinton or Bernie Sanders.
It certainly does. It certainly does. The one thing that I wanted to comment on the climate change and the Democrats.
Sure.
They removed God from their platform in the 2012 election, and they're trying to play God.
Well, they're convinced that we are having a disproportionate influence on the climate. And is it possible that some of the fossil fuel we're burning has some impact? Yes. Is that the reason the climate is changing? No, the climate has been changing since before we had the Industrial Revolution. And there are times where we actually had the sea levels much higher than they are right now. There is one city that used to be on the coast in the Netherlands. It was called the Venice of the Netherlands. And now the coast is 10 miles away. I mean, so let's face it, the sea levels have been going up and down for part. We've had an ice age. We've had a medieval warming period. Some of this has a little bit to do with human activity. I think a lot of it has a lot to do with solar cycles and all sorts of other things, and meteorological issues that are a little more complex than most of us can probably even understand. Certainly these computer models aren't accurate, so it's beyond our understanding sometimes. So maybe it's time for us to recognize that God is God, and we'll stop trying to play God. You ready for that?
Yes, sir. We are. We need to put it all in God's hands. I mean, all is God wills it, and it's not up to us.
Well, I appreciate your phone call. Let's, if we can, get in a few more phone calls real quickly. Let's head just a little bit north of there to North Carolina this time. Lee, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I just wanted to say that I think all Americans want fresh and new. And Hillary represents exactly the opposite of fresh and new. She's a return to an old, dingy, battered old time, and I just don't see how America would ever want to go dredge her from the past and put her in this position. We want fresh and new, and she is not it.
Well, that doesn't, again, work in the favor of the party. The party that has been in power for 8 years oftentimes has difficulty returning an individual in the same party to that office. Of course, you have George Herbert Walker Bush, who was elected after 8 years of Ronald Reagan. And, you could have changed a few votes in Florida, and maybe Al Gore could have won after Bill Clinton, but instead it was George W. Bush. But that is not working. And again, I think if people right now said, we really like where we're going here, we are not concerned about $20 trillion in debt. We think that the government regulation is fine, and we're quite willing to allow more regulation to take place. We think Obamacare has been okay, and we'll certainly let Hillary create kind of a Hillary Care 2. And if you are convinced that abortion is not an issue, then, of course, she's already made it very clear that she does not want to defund Planned Parenthood and wants to extend rights for women and on and on and on. If you believe that climate change is important and we need to tax carbon, well, then, Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, your people. If, on the other hand, you say, wait a minute, I think we are collapsing as an economy and we're collapsing as a culture, there's a real need for us to turn some of this around. There's a need for us to begin to deregulate the over-regulated state. We think the taxes are too high. We think we have spent ourselves into debt. Well, then I think you're going to want to look at, obviously, a Donald Trump or especially a Ted Cruz. So those are the options, and we're going to get into that in a little more detail in this next hour because Lawrence Lindsey will be with us. And it's so interesting that he's written a book called Conspiracies of the Ruling Class, because he admits, most people would think I was part of the ruling class. He said, I never thought of myself as the ruling class, but let's face it, he served under a number of different presidents. He was a professor at Harvard. He was on the Federal Reserve. And yet he's talking about conspiracies of the ruling class, how to break their grip forever. And as he talks, there'll be a few places where we'll disagree, but most of the time you're going to find him saying the same things we've said around the table here so many times before. So we'll get into that with him as well. Again, one more point that we made with Mike earlier, and I thought I would pick this out for, again, this very good piece by Tim Alberta, is the turnout in the Republican primary in Michigan was roughly 1.32 million, up more than 30% for the Republicans. Turnout for the Democrats was nearly 1.1 million. And again, that was no kind of apples to apples comparison. But when you look at this and realize that there is a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of energy on the Republican side, that may bode well for a Ted Cruz or a Donald Trump. See how that plays out. But they do have those very significant issues of the electoral map. And one last one, just before we take a break, I've got a commentary coming out next week on the FBI and Hillary Clinton, because one thing that changes every one of these polls is if indeed Hillary Clinton is indicted by the FBI. It certainly looks like FBI Director James Comey wants to do that. And so if indeed that is the case, then what happens? Well, if she actually is indicted, do the Democrats go to someone else, or do they just run with an indicted candidate that would have to actually go to court at some time? Or would this be forestalled by the Attorney General, Loretta Lynch, to simply say, well, even though in most cases we would indict a person, because she was the Secretary of State and because she's a presidential candidate, we just cannot affect the political process. So we will not indict somebody, even though if it was anybody other than her, we would indict them, probably prosecute them, and put them in jail. So we'll have to see how that plays out, and certainly those are some conversations to be had as well. Don't forget our Friday weekend edition. We're going to have a chance to look at some of the things said tonight at the Republican presidential debate, and also look ahead to what the next Super Tuesday contests were going to look like on March 15th. Let's take a break. And as we go to a break, let me mention again that as you go to our Pray, Organize, and Vote, we have a pledge for you to take. Please take the time to click on that button. Take the pledge to pray for our nation, to educate and encourage others to be involved, and most importantly, a pledge to vote in November. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more, especially with our interview with Lawrence Lindsey, right after this.
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Beam develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner. In theaters Wednesday, March 16th. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
How critical is the 2016 election? Well, the next president will very likely appoint at least 2, even 3 Supreme Court justices. Our on-budget debt is approaching $20 trillion, and the threats of war and terrorism all too real. Given these things, we're asking you to pray for our nation and to educate and encourage others to get involved. Sign up today at pointofview.net. We'll send reminders to help you pray, organize, and vote. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. The future of America is at stake. We need to pray. PointOfView.net. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I am constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
You know, around this program, sometimes we've talked about the fact that we are concerned about the fact that power seems to be moving away from the localities and from the states to the federal government. And at the same time, power seems to be moving away from elected officials to unelected officials. And we've had whole programs on that. And then, of course, a lot of people have talked about insiders and the establishment and the ruling class. So when this book came across my desk, which I've been referring to the last couple of days, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class, I said, if we could at all get Lawrence Lindsey on, I would love to do so, because a lot of people would have thought of him as being part of the ruling class. Now, he says in the book he never really considered himself as such, but consider his vita for just a minute and consider whether or not you would consider him to be such. Of course, he's the president and chief executive officer of the Lindsey Group. He's an individual that, of course, graduated from Harvard University, as we've mentioned before, has his master's as well as PhD, has taught there. He has been a governor of the Federal Reserve System. He has been the former director of the National Economic Council. He served under a number of presidents. And when he says he's concerned about conspiracies of the ruling class, I think all of us need to pay attention. So, Lawrence Lindsey, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
Well, thank you so much. And with that checkered resume, you're very kind to have me on.
No, it's a good resume. And Dr. Lindsey, I guess I should call you, since you actually do have your doctorate.
Call me Larry, please.
Okay. Is Larry okay? I feel funny because
Larry's
we've certainly watched you on television over the years, seen your area of the government. And, you know, I've gone to some of those institutions like Yale and Georgetown and things like that and followed your career. And I was fascinated by this book. But talk about this for just a minute. It seems to me that those of us concerned about federalism are recognizing that more and more of the decisions that I think the framers intended to be actually made at the state and local level are now being made by the federal government. And if I remember my civics class, which you know as well as I do, said that certain enumerated powers were delegated to the federal government. The rest were supposedly reserved to the states and people. That's sort of changed dramatically, hasn't it, in the last century?
Oh, absolutely. And, you know, you're spot on in describing what the problem is. Basically, it started about 100 years ago, and a group of people that then call themselves progressives and are again taking up that name,
yes,
have moved power, as you said in your introduction, from the states, from the people, and moved it to Washington. And then within Washington, they've moved it from elected people to unelected people. And this should concern us all. I mean, one example I like to give, and I give it in the book, is think about what the Federal Communications Commission did last year. You know, here are a bunch of unelected people, 5 of them, and they voted to give themselves power over the Internet. They didn't ask Congress to give them power. They gave it to themselves. Now, I don't have an opinion about running the Internet. I use it. That's about it. But what in democratic theory would say that 5 unelected people have the right to give themselves that kind of power? It's just kind of crazy. And so that's what is happening. That's a great example of what's happening, and it's something that I think we really have to stop before it's too late.
Well, and again, one of the things we've talked about on this program is that you had, of course, one of the Republican FCC commissioners talking about the fact that, in some respects, that regulation of the FCC, which is amazing, certainly reminded him of what has happened in the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. And the fact is that, first of all, you had lack of transparency. And second of all, as you point out, these unelected individuals gave themselves power. And if you really think that they should have power over the internet, isn't the proper way to go through Congress with a bill that actually enables them to do so, that is signed by the president? Isn't that how we learned this in our civics class?
Absolutely, and it's actually what the Constitution says. You know, we call it the State of the Union, but the Constitution actually says the president should come and describe the State of the Union and suggest bills to Congress to make things run better. That's the way it should happen. If the FCC really thought they should have power over the internet to do something, they should go through the president, or they can go themselves and ask the Congress for that power. But simply handing it over to yourself is just, it should be an affront to all of us.
Let me take one more example I know you use, and we'll get more into the book, and that has to do with the EPA. We talk about the FCC here, obviously, because it's a radio program, and so we're very aware of that. But again, I have lots of callers that say, wait a minute, a matter of fact, I remember when I was in school and we talked about the Clean Water Act. I remember when that was passed by President Nixon, but it was for navigable water. Now, I think the word navigable has been redefined. Explain.
Yeah, so, you and I and all of your listeners know what navigable means, right? It means something you can navigate. Let's be quite upfront about it. You got to be able to put a boat on and drive the boat around. Well, the EPA decided that really wasn't the case, that all you needed was a standing body of water. And it doesn't even have to be there 12 months a year. So you could have a drainage ditch by the side of the road, and your town or city who repairs the road now has to go to the EPA and apply for a permit, because some of what they do may end up in that drainage ditch along the side of the road. Or a farmer is now going to have to apply for a permit to put fertilizer in his crops because he may have a farm pond. Nobody's going to run a boat on a farm pond. It doesn't go anywhere. But now, according to the EPA, they have regulatory control over it. Now, if they wanted that control, fine. Go to the Congress and say, change the word navigable to all waterways. But they didn't do that. They simply define navigable water as any standing body of water, which, is an insult to the English language as well as to the law of the land.
Well, and again, as you point out, this is something that has been so broad that, Larry, I actually have had people call that say they're farmers or they're ranchers, and if there's we're not talking about a wetlands, we're just talking about part of their property that's wet maybe for maybe a month at most. That's enough to actually elicit and require EPA requirements and regulation. So we're not even talking about something that's a standing body of water. It's just a place that got wet and muddy for a while.
Right. Absolutely. And you can rest assured, you can figure out whether or not you have to apply. They have a 341-page rule that you can thumb through and say whether it applies to you. And if you, by the way, get it wrong, they can come and fine you. And if I'm not mistaken, the fine is $31,000 a day if you get it wrong.
Had one case and went to the Supreme Court we talked about with some of the people that were involved. Well, let's take a break. We have one of those mandatory breaks coming up. When we come back, though, Larry, I'd like to talk about the real meaning of 1776. We love history around here, and I think it would be important to at least go back for a few minutes, especially since we no longer have Antonin Scalia around, to talk about what the original intent was, first of the Declaration and of the Constitution, and then get into some of these specific ideas. This book, I'm sure you can find it in your local bookstore. I've seen it already advertised a number of places, published by Simon & Schuster. Conspiracies of the Ruling Class, How to Break Their Grip Forever. And it is written by Lawrence Lindsey. If you click on his picture there, we take you to his website, so you can go to lawrencelindsey.com, find out a little bit more about the book there. And if you're looking for information about the book, we have that where it's available both in hardback and in Kindle. And just a fascinating book. I'm just thrilled that he can be with us today. So we'll take a break. And a little bit later, we'll open up the phones. I suspect you might have some comments about some of these issues we're discussing. So we'll do that right after these messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
If Donald Trump becomes the Republican nominee, how difficult would it be for him to be elected president? To understand the challenge, it is worth looking at the electoral map, because any Republican nominee faces some significant challenges. A candidate needs 270 electoral votes to be elected president. Hillary Clinton starts with a significant advantage since there are 18 states and the District of Columbia that have voted Democratic in every presidential election since 1988. These are the New England states, except New Hampshire, a number of other eastern states, Delaware, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania. They also include states in the upper Midwest, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and they also include the West Coast states of California, Hawaii, Oregon, and Washington. These 18 states and the District of Columbia total 242 electoral votes. Hillary Clinton only needs to find 28 more electoral votes in order to achieve the 270 electoral votes. If Donald Trump cannot challenge in any of these blue states, then he must keep all the red states and nearly run the table on most of the toss-up states like Florida, Ohio, and Virginia. America's demographic makeup is another challenge. President Obama received over 90% of the African American vote and over 70% of the Hispanic American vote. Hillary Clinton may not do quite as well, but her vote percentages will certainly be close to those of candidate Barack Obama. Will Donald Trump receive more than 10% of the black vote? Perhaps, but that is doubtful. Will he receive more than 30% of the Latino vote? That is certainly unlikely since Donald Trump's negatives among Hispanics are the highest of any Republican candidate. Once you look at the electoral map, you can begin to see why many question whether Donald Trump could win in November. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Focus Features and Motive Entertainment present The Young Messiah, a story of Jesus as a youth, in theaters March 11th, rated PG-13. YoungMessiahResources.com.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Lawrence Lindsey as we talk about his new book, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class. Again, president of the Lindsey Group, an individual that actually has been on the economics faculty of Harvard University, also held the chair of economic research at the American Enterprise Institute, was a governor with the Federal Reserve, as well as, of course, director of the National Economic Council, to mention just a few of the various positions he's held over the years. And Larry, let's, if we can, maybe for just a few minutes, remind our listeners about our history. You have a chapter here about liberty, the real meaning of 1776. What did the founders of our country in the Declaration and then the framers in the Constitution intend for us to actually have as a government and as a structure of government?
Well, they were revolutionaries, obviously. They fought against the British Empire, but they were also intellectual revolutionaries. They were the first people to actually lay out a framework for government in which government was there to serve the people rather than the people being there to serve the government.
Yes.
And that's a very radical idea. And so they laid that out plainly in the Declaration that the purpose of government is to preserve the rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And in the Constitution, they were afraid that a ruling class might actually subvert government and come back and go to the old-fashioned way where we work for the government rather than vice versa. So they made it hard for a ruling class to do it. They, as you mentioned earlier, and we talk about in the book, they put a lot of power in the states. They said a lot of power belongs to the people and can never be touched. And they laid out specifically, the word is enumerated powers, exactly what the federal government can do. Well, it turns out that the federal government, by the way, they also made it hard for the federal government to do anything. That's why we have two houses of Congress and why the president has to sign the bills and everything else. What happened gradually was we sort of forgot about that. The courts in Washington moved power away from the people. They let the government do more and more things that were definitely not enumerated. And so now we have a situation where power rests in Washington and power rests with the unelected in Washington to an extent that would, leave the founding fathers really scratching their heads.
Well, and again, you had, as you said, you had, first of all, the vertical distribution of powers, Article 1, Section 8, and that is certain powers delegated to the federal government, the rest reserved to the people. Horizontal distribution of powers, because you had executive branch, legislative branch, and judicial branch. But over time, Larry, let's, if we can, talk about how that switched, and it was due in part to desires, Woodrow Wilson and other progressives, but also I think it's due in large part to the fact that sometimes Congress didn't want to do their job, and they were quite content to say, okay, we'll let the Supreme Court decide about affirmative action, busing, abortion, all sorts of religious liberty issues and all the rest, because we've got to run for re-election, so we'll just let them deal with issues that I don't think the framers ever intended for them to deal with, or else we'll turn it to the bureaucrats and let them deal with all those issues.
I think that's very fair. Now, the argument that they first gave was that, gosh, the world is such a more complicated place today
yes.
than it was back in 1776. So we need experts to do it, okay? Well, all right, I suppose some people would think of me, I'm an expert in economics in some sense of the word, but so is a doctor. And when you go to the doctor, you pay the doctor, and he says, here's what I recommend you do. You can take his advice or not take his advice, but the power is still with you. There's nothing wrong with hiring experts, but you don't have the expert dictatorial power over your life. And increasingly, that's what the government is doing. These, quote, experts are actually making decisions that we should make. We have a great case that's discussed in the book that there's something called the Interstate Commerce Clause.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that, because that's something we've been talking about quite a bit with Kelly Shackelford, so go for that, yeah.
So the Congress says the government can regulate interstate commerce. What they had in mind was they wanted to make sure that, California didn't erect barriers to Nevada or New Jersey to New York. And, those are real concerns. They wanted us to have free trade between the states. But in the 1930s and early 1940s, that whole idea was sort of turned on its head. So there was a case of a farmer who grew crops on his own land,
right,
fed those crops to his horses. The horses processed them and left what was left over back on his own land. Nothing ever left his own land. They didn't cross his property line. They didn't cross the county line. They didn't cross the state line. And yet the court ultimately ruled, it was a tough decision, that because if he didn't grow crops on his own land, then he would have had to buy the stuff to feed his animals on interstate commerce, and therefore he had an effect on interstate commerce, and therefore the government can come in and tell him how much wheat he could grow. Now, that is such a convoluted stretch of what is meant by the Commerce Clause. It's actually, to me, quite shocking. But that's where we stand right now. And the government, largely by using unelected courts, and to some extent FDR bullied the court into doing this, have just taken on power that the Founding Fathers simply wouldn't believe is possible.
And again, just to explain to people, Mr. Filburn was a family farmer. He's just trying to survive, and he exceeded the quota and was fined for doing so, and then they used the Commerce Clause. Now, again, the fact that there were quotas and all of that, of course, part of that was due to first the Great Depression, then World War II. But all of this sounds like something from a communist country. But again, once you had that precedent, which says that no longer did it even have to cross state lines, the Commerce Clause could be as elastic as you want it to be used. And guess what? Then it shows up in things like what? The Affordable Care Act and all sorts of other decisions that are talking about mandates and all sorts of other issues that were never, I think, intended by the framers of the Constitution, nor even even intended by most Americans if they were to be asked their question or have their elected representatives deal with that particular issue.
Right. I mean, using the example of Mr. Filburn, suppose you decided to mow your own lawn.
Yes.
Well, that has an effect on interstate commerce because you didn't hire the kid down the street to mow it, and therefore the government has the right to stop you from mowing your own lawn. I mean, that's the kind of absurd, and I think that's a fair word, use of the Commerce Clause that the government has taken power onto itself to have.
You know, we've talked about the FCC, and some of our listeners might say, well, I can relate to that a little bit, but not a whole lot. The EPA, well, some of our farmers can relate to that. Some of our farmers can relate to this one of the Commerce Clause, but a lot of our listeners can relate to the issue of the Second Amendment and gun control. And you talk about this idea that, first of all, most of the murders, gun murders, are committed by people that are already prohibited by law from owning the gun. And yet the ruling class today is calling for more gun legislation that are actually going to affect law-abiding citizens. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's very, very fair. When the gun control regulation comes out, what do? Well, they defined a particular kind of gun that you can buy. That's not going to stop a murder because, if that gun, first of all, the only people who are going to turn in their guns are the law-abiding people. The criminals are going to keep their guns. And so, by definition, it's said a lot. If guns are outlawed, only outlaws will have guns. But what, both President Obama and Mrs. Clinton have said very nice things about the Australian gun law. Now, what Australia did was actually go out and confiscate. They paid people, but you had to turn them in. A quarter of all the guns in Australia. They simply went in and forced them to purchase it. Now, if we did something like that, we're talking on the order of 75 million guns, maybe $75 billion in spending. But what a lot of people want to do is think that government has the right to take those guns because somebody might get harmed with the gun. Actually, 80% of all of the murders in the country are done by felons. And felons, by definition, can't own guns. So there's very, very little that the Congress can do here that would actually reduce the total number of gun deaths in the country.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation of conspiracies of the ruling class. We've looked a little bit at some of that in part 1, the greatest threat to liberty. We also want to talk about part 2, the mismanagement of government by the self-interested ruling class, and then also part 3, securing our liberty once again. So we have quite a bit more to cover, but if you'd like to join us, you can certainly do so, or it's just one of these programs where I think you might just want to sit back and listen, take some notes, and certainly get a copy of the book. It's published by Simon & Schuster, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class. You should be able to find it in your local bookstore, about 300 pages. We have information about it on our website, pointofview.net. Let's take a break. We'll continue our conversation with Lawrence Lindsey right after this.
From Focus Features, in association with Motive Entertainment, comes The Young Messiah.
We seek a family from Nazareth with a boy named Jesus.
The Young Messiah imagines the journey of Jesus with his family from Egypt to Nazareth and on to Jerusalem, where his identity is revealed and his destiny fulfilled.
He's just a child.
He is not just a child.
In theaters March 11th. Rated PG-13, may not be appropriate for children under 13. More information at youngmessiahresources.com. Are you concerned about what's happening in our colleges, our marketplace, and the halls of government? Let me ask, have you invested in things that yield a good harvest? If you're already giving to Point of View each month, we thank you. You share in the reward for what we harvest. If you're not, now is the time. $30, $65, $100. The more you invest on a regular basis, the more we'll reap together. Give online at pointofview.net. Pointofview.net. Click at the top on Become a Monthly Partner or call 800-347-5151. 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Dr. Lawrence Lindsey as we talk about his new book, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class. Certainly want to get into a section on securing our liberties once again, but before we do so, the middle section deals with mismanagement. And Larry, I think there are some people that might say, well, I don't mind too much if the federal government takes over if they do a good job, but they don't do a good job. And in particular, when we talk about the ruling class, let's look at your area of expertise. The ruling class have failed in reducing inequality and really have mismanaged America's finances. So what about this? The ruling class are supposed to be smarter than us. They have their progressive superiority complex, but they haven't managed the economic household very well at all in America, have they?
No, and inequality is the issue that right now they talk about the most. First of all, I don't know of anyone who's ever run for office who's for more inequality, right? But the progressives in general tend to, shout about the need to reduce inequality. Well, the fact is that ever since Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society, inequality's increased in America. It's increased under every president. And more surprising is that it's increased more under progressive presidents than under Republican presidents.
Yes.
For example, under Obama, inequality increased far more than it did under his predecessor, George Bush. Under Bill Clinton, it increased far more than it did under Ronald Reagan. In fact, it rose more under Bill Clinton's 8 years than it did under Reagan's and George Herbert Walker Bush's, Bush 41's terms combined. So, they may talk about it, but they're lousy at delivering. And they're moving a lot of money. Do you know $1 in every 6 that people receive right now is what government calls a transfer payment. It's money coming from the government, actually basically from us through the government, to people in order to reduce inequality. $1 in 6. We're talking here about something on the order of over $2 trillion being redistributed by the government. If you and I could move $2 trillion around, don't you think we could reduce inequality? I do, but we haven't done it. And, there was something in there about, it might be the policies themselves that are to blame. And a lot of those policies simply give people something for nothing. And when somebody doesn't have a sense of self-worth,
right,
because they're not contributing, they're poor both financially, but also spiritually, and they're not going to climb out of the poverty trap. Now, Barack Obama is the first president in American history under which there are going to be fewer two-earner couples when he leaves office than when he started office. And 2/3 of all the families that have been formed under Barack Obama have no earners under them, 0. Well, how can you solve inequality? How can people make better lives for themselves if we're in a situation where there's no earners in the household?
Yes.
And, it's a tragic situation.
Well, again, as we've said before, I guess it's an old Phil Gramm statement, but, what happens when you have more people in the wagon than you have people pulling the wagon? You can figure that one out pretty simply. But let me jump to another one that you talk about, because one of the things Barack Obama was best known for is shovel-ready projects. We heard all about that with the stimulus, but you have a whole section here on the infrastructure, and you basically figure out that if I put in a driveway, and I'm actually thinking about doing this at my house, it would cost the government a whole lot more to put in a road than for me to do it myself. It seems to me that this is a good example of overregulation as well as all sorts of various disincentives to doing anything efficiently.
Absolutely. Government actually spends 2/3 more per square foot than you and I do. They spend 2/3 more on their roads per square foot than you and I do building our driveways. And it comes back to federal contracting laws. They are so complicated that really only a few people can master all the laws. And so contracts don't go to the low bidder, which is the way you and I would do it. they go to people who are able to master the contracting process. And, that's one of the things that drives up costs. It's ridiculous.
One other one I thought I'd get into just before we talk about some of the solutions is, the ruling class have earned an F in education. When we talk about education, you always have two solutions. One saying, can't we bring it back to the local schools? And the other saying, no, we just haven't spent enough money on it yet. What about this? How have we had a school system that was the wonder of the world now is failing the American children? How did that happen?
Well, it didn't come about because of a lack of money. I can assure you of that. We're spending a little over $11,000 for every child in K through 12.
Yes.
Now, think of a class of 20. Well under half of it goes to the teacher. Where does the rest of it go? And it gives a sense, that in my mind gives a sense of just how wasteful it is. The typical European country doesn't spend 11, they spend around $8,000 per pupil, and they get much higher test scores. We're 3/4 of the way down the list on international comparisons when it comes to how our students do in reading or math or writing. And that means we're spending a lot of money and getting a bad product for it. And that's got to end.
Certainly. I thought I'd get one more, and that is the ruling class and your property or theirs, just because I've started writing about this, some of this confiscated property, and it's something that pretty much I first. And this is, I think, an issue that most Americans are not aware of. But can you briefly explain that? Because, again, this confiscated property and this taking of property without due process is a real major concern. And it's one that I think is going to be an issue in the future as people begin to understand more about it.
Right. The fancy name is civil asset forfeiture. And what that means is that the government can come in and say, you weren't using that property properly. We'll talk about what that may mean. And we're going to take your money or your property. We're not even going to charge you with a crime. We're just going to take your money. And you have to come and sue and prove that you were innocent. Now, that's exactly the opposite of what the Constitution says, right? You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. No, under civil asset forfeiture, you're presumed guilty until proven innocent. Now, a little bit worse, this money is then divided up among the law enforcement agencies that seize the money. So guess the law enforcement agencies are no longer neutral about seizing it. They put the money in their pocket. And, there's famous cases where some of them used it for trips to Disney World and stuff like that. And, this turns things on its head. Now, we had one sort of surprising twist, and that was Attorney General Lynch. Now, when she was a prosecutor, she bragged about how much money she took from people with civil asset forfeiture. Now, a lot of these people did absolutely nothing wrong. And lo and behold, when she was nominated to be Attorney General, these people came forward and said, this person took my money and didn't give it back. Well, it got to be quite a stink. And guess what? Before she was confirmed, surprise, surprise, those people got their money back.
Yes.
And that's just proof that they had no case to begin with. It was simply money going into the government's pocket. And it's hit new records under the Obama administration.
And in that chapter, you also talk about the IRS and Loretta Lynch and some of the others we've talked about. Sometimes, Larry, on Friday we have a weekend edition, but we also do a section on religious liberty. And sometimes people from First Liberty or Liberty Institute or American Center for Law and Justice, whoever, join us and we talk about some of those stories. But we need to take a break. And when we come back, I want to look a little bit on securing our liberty once again, because you believe that we have a pro-liberty majority. And it certainly talks about the importance of the vote. And as you have certainly been following us over these last couple of weeks, we have our Pray, Organize, and Vote election resource and encourage you to find out a little bit more. Some of you, of course, have voted in the primary, but if you still have to vote, there is information there about many of the candidates. And we certainly encourage you to check it out there and also to take our pledge to not only pray for this nation, but also to make sure that you encourage others to get good information and to vote, especially when that opportunity comes up in November for all of us. And for some of you, in the next couple of days when some of you will be voting on March 15th. Let's take a break, though, and if you'd like some more information about this book, we have it on our website, pointofview.net, Conspiracies of the Ruling Class, How to Break Their Grip Forever. Lawrence Lindsey has been with us, and he will be with us as we finish off that book and give you a chance to hear about what are the solutions to the problems we've been talking about today. And we'll get into those very quickly as we end the program. But let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Lawrence Lindsey as we talk about the ruling class and how we can bring power back to we the people. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Dr. Lawrence Lindsey with us for a few more minutes as we talk about his book, Conspiracy of the Ruling Class. And one of the things that I think a lot of people might ask, Larry, is if indeed the ruling class has done so poorly, how is it that the ruling class is able to get their people elected to office? And some of this, I think, also relates back to many of the surveys showing that most Americans right now feel that America is going in the wrong direction. How are we supposed to think about that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The majorities are very, very heavy, by 40 points or so, about people going in the wrong direction. But here's something that's interesting, and that's how they win elections. So right after President Obama was reelected in 2012, there was a survey question that said, would you like to have a more active government with more services and higher taxes, or a smaller government with fewer services and lower taxes? Now, we just had an election where that was supposedly the issue. The public wanted lower taxes and a smaller government by a margin of 56 to 34,
yes,
a 22-point margin. And yet, Barack Obama had just been reelected president. And I think the reason is that we did not make that key question. Do you want the ruling class to have more control or less control? That's the central focus in the campaign. And the ruling class is very good about raising a lot of other issues that really aren't central to that basic question of freedom. And they're able to confuse and divide the voters, and that's what happens. I hope what we do this year is we stick to the issue where we are clearly in the majority, and that is, do you want bigger government with more control of your lives, or smaller government and a government where you have more control of your own life?
While we're talking about that, one of the sections you talk about there is Obamacare. And it seems to me that sometimes you have to come up with an alternative. Just abolish Obamacare isn't as effective as would you not like to have an opportunity to choose your own doctor, to keep your own doctor, keep your own insurance policy, and have greater control over the decisions that you and your doctor make? Well, that is probably a much more positive message than abolish Obamacare, isn't it? And it seems like it would work better, too.
It definitely would work better. And, what happened with Obamacare and the reason why it has failed so badly is that they not only provided sort of what I would call a basic health insurance to everybody, they were very, very prescriptive in everything that had to be covered. I mean, one thing they did for purely political reasons, for example, is they required that all plans carry contraceptive coverage. Well, that's not a necessity. We need health insurance for large expenditures over which, something may happen to us over which we have no control, not relatively small discretionary expenditures. When you buy insurance for your car, you don't insure for your gas purchases, for example.
Right.
And so what we need is a much more focused set of choices. And the key word there was choices. When workers, families, and employers have full range of choice without regulatory restrictions coming from Washington on the products they can offer, they can select a policy that actually suits the needs of the people who are being covered. They don't have to buy things that they really don't want to have. And I think, again, moving toward freedom of choice is really probably the best way to go in solving the healthcare problem.
Certainly would agree. We talked about the importance of voting. Of course, that's one of the emphasis we've had here on Point of View. But sometimes people say voting is one thing, but you also talk about this issue of term limits. And that is something that's very popular among the people. I also recognize that it seems almost impossible to get Congress to term limit itself. But assuming we can do that, and maybe that's a Article 5 convention, or maybe we get enough people elected to office to recognize that's important. That's another issue as well, because Congress is based on a seniority system. It's also based on bringing pork home to the families and the communities and the districts. And so as a result, there needs to be perhaps some structural change, don't you think?
Well, maybe. But, since 1994, we've done a pretty good job of term limiting those guys.
Yeah, we have.
And we do it the good old-fashioned way. We vote them out of office.
Get rid of them.
And so we get rid of them. And so we actually have the constitutional ability to get rid of elected members of Congress. The problem is that we have a lot of people who aren't subject to vote. Judges, for example. Imagine having a judge for a life term.
Yes.
You could just look at what's happening today. We're fighting over a seat on the Supreme Court. So 1 of 9 unelected people. Now, in a normal democratic society, that wouldn't be a central issue. But because so much power has been moved to these unelected people, it is a major issue, I think, this November. And the President and the Senate are going to be fighting over it all year. Those are the kinds of people that need to be term limited, because giving someone, a lifetime appointment with the amount of power the courts have, an 18-year term makes them politically independent. One would turn over every 2 years, something like that. Same thing's true with bureaucrats. It's almost impossible to fire a bureaucrat even if they do a bad job. In the book, we go through details of just how silly it is.
Sure.
And even most people in Washington think that way. But unfortunately, we need to be able to have better hiring and firing practices if we want to have a more sensible government. And that's where I think the term limiting is needed.
So again, the Civil Service Act of 1883, some things need to be changed a little bit, and those are some of the structural changes, but nothing else. This book is just fascinating, and Dr. Lindsey, first of all, I want to say thank you for writing it, and it's entitled Conspiracies of the Ruling Class. If people would like to know a little bit more, they can go to our website, pointofview.net, and of course, if they just click on that website link, we take them to lawrencelindsey.com, in which you have more information about the book. I imagine they can find it in the local bookstore, but if not, we've made it very easy for them to order it. And so thank you so very much for writing it, and thank you for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Well, thanks so much for having me. It was fascinating chatting with you.
We will take a break, and then tomorrow, of course, you know what we're going to be talking about, the Republican debate tonight. That will give you that opportunity to hear some of the comments as we played today, some of those from the Democratic presidential debate. And then we'll have Debbie Georgiadis and Penna Dexter with us. We'll give you a little bit of analysis of what was said tonight, and then, of course, look ahead to the political campaign. So all sorts of opportunities to get into these issues. And, of course, we'll open up the phones again tomorrow to give you a chance to join the conversation. That, I think, will be an opportunity for you as well. Let me mention, just before we run out of time, a couple of things. First of all, I mentioned earlier my viewpoint section. Today it's on the electoral map. The challenges that, say, a Donald Trump, if he is nominated, or a Ted Cruz, if he's nominated, faces against a Democratic nominee, which we assume is Hillary Clinton or could be Bernie Sanders. And so some of the issues that are relevant there. And so you can read that and maybe print it out, pass it on to some others, put it on your Facebook page, have a conversation about it. Of course, we're still encouraging you, if you have not done so, to take action on the Equality Act, and that's there as well. But most importantly, I want to point you to the Pray, Organize, and Vote one-stop election resource. And most importantly, even if you've been there before, take the time to click on it again. We're encouraging you to take the pledge. And this is the pledge to pray for our nation, to educate and encourage others to get involved in the election, and then finally, of course, the pledge to vote. And so these are some opportunities for praying, organizing, and voting. Once you do that, it will then take you to all the information that we have there. We have some videos for you to watch. We have information about the various candidates. And if you are not voting yet and don't know whether or not you're registered to vote, you can check there. Or you don't know where your voting place is, you can check that there. We've tried to provide you with a lot of resources so that you can make intelligent decisions about that. Tomorrow, of course, is our weekend edition. We will be watching the Republican presidential debate tonight. We'll play some of those clips tomorrow. And, of course, we invite your comments and criticisms as well as questions. So all of that is available tomorrow. I want to thank Andrew, Catherine, and Shamila for their help behind the scenes. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
Columbia Pictures presents, in association with Affirm Films, Miracles from Heaven. When 10-year-old Anna Beam develops a rare incurable disease, her mother devotes herself to finding a solution.
Miracles are everywhere.
Then, after Anna has a freak accident, a miracle unfolds. How do we explain the impossible? Miracles from Heaven, starring Jennifer Garner. In theaters Wednesday, March 16th. Rated PG. Parental guidance suggested. More information is available at miraclesfromheaven-movie.com.
How critical is the 2016 election? Well, the next president will very likely appoint at least 2, even 3 Supreme Court justices. Our on-budget debt is approaching $20 trillion, and the threats of war and terrorism all too real. Given these things, we're asking you to pray for our nation and to educate and encourage others to get involved. Sign up today at pointofview.net. We'll send reminders to help you pray, organize, and vote. Pointofview.net. Click on the banner, Pray, Organize, Vote. The future of America is at stake. We need to pray. Pointofview.net. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for